My brothers, my sisters, welcome back to the channel. Today we speak not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa's awakening. If you believe in freedom, unity, and the power of our people, then make sure you subscribe, share this story, and let the world hear Africa's voice. Because what you are about to witness is not just history, that is destiny. Rain spilled down in thin, whispering streams, tracing trembling veins down the window of a dim restaurant in the heart of Ouagadougou. The night was heavy, thick with smoke, cheap laughter, and the scent of oil and meat turning over slow flames. Inside, under flickering lights, a group of well-dressed men sat near the corner, their voices too loud for the quietness that surrounded them. Power often spoke that way, drunk, careless, and cruel. In a shadowed booth near the far end of the room, a man sat alone. His coat was simple, the fabric worn, the kind of attire that made him invisible. But his eyes, those held the weight of storms. No one knew that the man quietly watching was Ibrahim Traoré, the African leader who had spent nights on battlefields and days in meeting rooms thick with hypocrisy. Tonight, he was just a man, seeking a moment away from the noise of his own name. The waitress moved nervously between tables, her hands shaking slightly as she placed dishes before the loud group. Their mockery grew sharper as their glasses emptied. Then the door opened, and the wind carried in a shiver of rain, along with her. A young, pregnant woman stepped in, drenched, hesitant. Her clothes were modest, her face pale, her eyes the color of fear. She carried a small bag that she clutched to her chest as if it were her entire life. The hostess glanced at her awkwardly. She didn't belong here, not among polished shoes and perfume. The group of men saw her too, and that was when the laughter turned. They whispered first, then mocked aloud, cruel jokes about her condition, her poverty, her audacity to enter a place like this. One of them gestured for her to leave. Another reached out and took the chair beside him, pulling it back with a screech that sliced through the restaurant. The laughter became a weapon, sharp and echoing. The woman froze, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but had forgotten the shape of words. A few onlookers turned their heads away, pretending not to see. The air grew colder, denser, and in the far corner, Ibrahim Traoré's hand stilled over his cup of tea. He had seen this before, not here, not like this, but everywhere. Power mocking weakness. Men using laughter to hide fear. The same story replayed 1,000 times in markets, in offices, in international halls where the poor were dismissed with smiles too polished to be human. He looked at the woman, at her shaking shoulders, and saw not one victim, but millions across Africa, silenced by comfort and pride. The waitress whispered something to her, maybe a quiet plea to ignore them, but the mockery grew louder. The men now stood, one tossing a few coins at her feet as if she were a beggar. Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with a breaking kind of silence, the kind that carries centuries of humiliation, and then the chair scraped. The man in the corner stood up. At first, no one noticed. His movement was calm, deliberate, almost ghostly. He walked across the room, his boots leaving quiet imprints on the cracked tile floor. The laughter faltered as he approached, though they didn't know why. Something in the air shifted, the unspoken recognition of presence, the kind that makes people straighten their backs without understanding the reason. He stopped between the woman and the men. The rain outside grew louder, pounding against the glass like a heartbeat. The waitress froze. The woman looked up, her breath caught halfway. The men smirked, still unaware of who stood before them. The leader of the group stepped forward, wine-stained lips curving in arrogance. "You lost, old man?" he asked, his tone drenched in mockery. Traoré didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence spoke heavier than anger ever could. His gaze lingered on the coins, scattered at the woman's feet, then slowly rose to meet theirs. The entire restaurant had gone still. Even the music seemed to fade away. For a moment, no one breathed, and then, quietly, almost like a whisper, he reached into his coat and placed a single folded note beside the woman's hand. The bills were crisp, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the act, a silent message. The waitress gasped softly. The men looked at each other, confusion flickering beneath their smirks. And in that same silence, something inside the woman's face changed. The faint glimmer of dignity returning. The invisible crown of human worth restored. When he turned to leave, the laughter didn't return. Not that night. Not ever in that place again. Outside, the storm had softened, but the wind carried the sound of something deeper, the quiet pulse of conscience. He walked into the rain, coat clinging to his shoulders, and for a brief second under the streetlight his face was visible, a soldier standing in shadows, a leader walking among ghosts, an African man who refused to look away. That was the night everything began to change, though no one yet knew how deep the consequences would run. They bullied a pregnant woman, not knowing an African leader was watching, and what he did next would change everything. The next morning, the city stirred under the pale breath of dawn, slow, indifferent, unaware that something had shifted in the night. Ouagadougou woke as it always did, street vendors calling out to early customers, children in faded uniforms chasing one another through puddles, and the distant hum of motorbikes weaving through morning fog. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, whispers began. Someone had stood up at La Rivière Bleue, the restaurant where the wealthy dined and the poor were turned away. Someone had silenced the untouchable men who laughed too loudly. By mid-morning, the story had twisted into a dozen versions. A mysterious man confronting the elite, a hooded stranger protecting a woman, a ghost from the past who punished cruelty. The name Traoré wasn't yet spoken, not out loud, but those who had seen his eyes that night could not forget. In his office later that morning, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone, the blinds half closed. The city's noise felt distant. On his desk lay reports, economic breakdowns, agricultural crises, border insecurity, all the usual enemies. But his mind wasn't on paper. It was on the face of that woman, the trembling of her hands, the hollow look that had burned itself into his memory. He had been to summits and wars, had faced foreign delegations with eyes sharp enough to cut through deceit, but the cruelty of the night before haunted him more than any battlefield. It wasn't about one woman, it was about everything he was trying to change. The disease of dignity lost, the quiet slavery of fear. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. His aide entered, clutching a folder. "Sir," he began carefully, "there's a situation involving the restaurant from last night." Traoré's head lifted. The aide hesitated, unsure how much his leader already knew. "There was an incident. The owner, the manager, several of the men involved. They're all connected. One of them is on a government contract for food distribution. Another is related to an opposition general." Silence. "And the woman?" Traoré asked. His voice was calm, almost detached. "She's gone, sir. No one knows where. She didn't return home. The neighbors said she was being followed days before the incident." A heavy stillness filled the room. Outside, the wind pressed faintly against the glass, a low murmur, like the city itself was holding its breath. Traoré rose from his chair. His eyes were steady, but behind them lay a storm. He had seen this pattern before. Injustice didn't end at humiliation. It hid networks beneath it. The restaurant wasn't just a place for dining. It was a front, a meeting point for men who fed off the weakness of others. By afternoon, he ordered a discreet internal inquiry. No announcements, no official letters, just quiet eyes watching quiet men. And within hours, the first cracks appeared. Payments traced to shell companies, names that shouldn't have been on ledgers, money moving like whispers through the corridors of privilege. That night, Traoré didn't go home. He sat alone in the archives beneath the presidential compound, where files from past administrations lay buried like corpses of forgotten truths. The fluorescent lights hummed above him as he flipped through old reports, contracts, missing persons lists. The more he read, the heavier the air grew. There were dozens of women, nameless, faceless, who had vanished over the years. Market workers, cleaners, waitresses. Each disappearance filed away under bureaucracy's dust. The same signatures appeared in different corners of different reports, names belonging to the men from the restaurant. His chest tightened. Rage burned low and steady, like a furnace. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For a moment he saw Thomas Sankara's portrait on the far wall, the man who had dreamed of a selfless Africa, of dignity unbought and courage unbroken. Sankara's gaze was unwavering, even from a photograph. It felt like a question whispered from the past. What will you do now, Ibrahim? The following days unfolded in tension disguised as calm. The inquiry deepened quietly. Files were transferred to unmarked envelopes, witnesses interviewed in secret. Traoré avoided public appearances, choosing instead to meet with a small circle of trusted officers under dim light and sealed doors. Yet word began to spread beyond control. The elite grew nervous. Some laughed it off in confidence. Others fled the city for business trips. The story of the mysterious man at La Rivière Bleue had evolved into rumor and legend, fueling curiosity and fear alike. One evening, as the sun melted into crimson behind the horizon, a package was delivered to the compound. No return address. Inside, a single USB drive and a photo. The photo showed the pregnant woman, but not as she had been that night. She was standing outside an abandoned warehouse, her face half in shadow, eyes glancing sideways as if she knew she was being watched. The USB contained video footage. Grainy, shaky, showing men moving crates at night. But it wasn't just goods. The faint outlines of people, restrained, could be seen in the corner of the frame. Human trafficking. The blood in Traoré's veins turned cold. He replayed the video again and again. The restaurant, the missing woman, the contracts. It all connected. And the men behind it weren't petty criminals. They were embedded, protected, by institutions designed to appear clean. That night, Ibrahim stood by his office window. The city lights glittered like broken promises, scattered across a dark horizon. He knew what had to come next, but the cost would be high. He would have to expose people powerful enough to crush him politically, even physically. Outside, the thunder rolled again, as if the storm that had begun in that restaurant had not yet finished speaking. He closed his eyes and whispered a quiet prayer. Not for safety, but for courage, because this was no longer about a bullied woman. It was about the soul of a nation that had forgotten how to defend the helpless. And in the silence of that moment, something within him hardened, not hatred, not vengeance, but resolve. The leader had watched injustice. Now he would hunt it. The following week unfolded like a tightening noose. The city's rhythm had not changed. The laughter in the markets, the hum of the motorbikes, the evening call to prayer echoing over rooftops. But somewhere beneath the surface, fear began to move. A fear known only to those who had built their wealth upon shadows. Ibrahim Traoré didn't appear on television. His silence was deliberate, his absence intentional. The fewer eyes watching him, the more clearly he could see. The inquiry had already uncovered what he had feared, a web stretching from businessmen to officers, from ministers to media figures, each feeding from the same poisoned well. And at the center, the restaurant, La Rivière Bleue, the glittering doorway through which respectability masked rot. Each night, he reviewed new evidence in his private study, the walls lit by a single dim lamp. Images, files, bank transfers, coded conversations. He could trace the chain of corruption like arteries in a diseased body. There were foreign links too, offshore accounts, quiet investors from beyond Africa who profited from the exploitation of its people. He could almost hear their laughter in the static hum of the documents, the kind of laughter that echoes across oceans because it believes no one will ever answer it. But Ibrahim was answering it. In silence, with precision. A small trusted task force was formed, soldiers, investigators, and civilians whose loyalty had been tested in storms. They operated without uniforms, without announcement. They infiltrated the same restaurants, the same bars, the same glittering circles of pretense. Every whisper, every careless boast was recorded. Then came the first warning, a car following him through the night, a shadow shifting outside his home. A letter slipped beneath his office door. No name, no threats, just a message. You saw something that wasn't meant for you. He burned it, but his resolve only deepened. One evening, a soldier from the task force arrived, breathless, soaked from rain. "Sir," he said, voice trembling, "we found her." The woman. She was alive, barely. Hidden in a safe house outside the capital, too frightened to speak, too weak to stand. They had taken her to silence her, but she had escaped through sheer chance, or something greater. When Ibrahim met her, she didn't recognize him. She saw only a man in plain clothes sitting across from her in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. Her eyes were sunken, her voice faint. But when she began to speak, the story that spilled out turned the room cold. The restaurant was only one of many. Behind the laughter and music, deals were struck. Human lives traded as quietly as fine wines poured into glasses. Women forced into disappearance, men used for labor and silence. Every protest met with the same answer: nothing. She had been targeted after witnessing one of those exchanges. She wasn't supposed to survive. Ibrahim listened without moving. Every word weighed upon him like a stone. When she finished, she looked down and whispered, "Why did you help me that night?" "You didn't even know me." He didn't answer immediately. His hands were folded, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "Because every nation dies when its people stop standing up for those who can't." She wept silently. By the next morning, the investigation shifted from shadows to strikes. Hidden cameras placed in the restaurants. Files leaked to journalists trusted to risk their lives. Arrests planned under the cover of night, but the elite weren't waiting quietly. 3 of his ministers resigned suddenly, citing health issues. A general called for an emergency meeting. Social media exploded with rumors. Some accusing Traoré of overreach, others calling it a purge. Even allies grew silent. Inside the presidential compound, tension thickened. Some of his own guards looked uncertain. The enemy wasn't just outside now. It was inside the walls. And then the attempt came. It was subtle, almost invisible. A convoy rerouted without orders. An explosion meant to appear as an accident. But Ibrahim had changed his route minutes before. The blast tore through the road behind him, lighting up the night like a wound in the earth. The country woke up to confusion. State media downplayed it. Foreign networks speculated. But among his people, something different began to stir. The rumor that their leader had survived an assassination attempt, and that he was fighting a hidden war for them. When he returned to the capital 3 days later, the streets fell silent. No public speech, no cameras, only a convoy gliding through dawn's first light. In the following nights, raids began, quietly, precisely, one by one. The men who had laughed at La Rivière Bleue were taken away in unmarked vehicles. Their mansions raided, accounts frozen, files seized. What started as a single act of compassion had become a national reckoning, but the resistance grew louder too. Foreign ambassadors called for dialogue. Reports accused him of authoritarianism. Financial aid was threatened. Anonymous voices whispered that he was risking everything for one woman, one story, and yet, Ibrahim knew it wasn't just one story. It was the mirror of a continent, how easily power forgot its duty, how often silence disguised complicity. There was one more name, the last link in the chain. The owner of La Rivière Bleue, a figure who never appeared publicly, who moved through embassies and private flights. When the task force traced him, the address led to an abandoned government building near the river, sealed for years. Ibrahim went there himself. No cameras, no guards, just him and 2 soldiers. Inside, the air was thick with mold and memory. Broken furniture, files scattered across the floor, faint echoes of conversations long gone. In one of the rooms, a projector still worked, looping footage from charity events, awards, speeches about progress and hope. The same faces he had seen on corruption reports. He stood in the flickering light, watching the ghosts of hypocrisy dance across the walls. It struck him then. The true enemy wasn't just greed. It was the performance of goodness, the mask of benevolence that evil wore so well. The rain began outside again, heavy and endless. He looked out through a shattered window at the city lights below and whispered to himself, "If justice costs everything, then so be it." That night, he ordered the final operation. not to punish, but to reveal. The world would soon see what had been hidden beneath its polished veneer. And when dawn rose, the air over Burkina Faso carried both fear and hope, for no one yet knew which would win. The city never slept that night. It pretended to, but the air knew. Every alley hummed with unspoken tension. Every rooftop seemed to listen. Every streetlight flickered as if holding its breath. The operation had begun. Long before midnight, unmarked vehicles slipped through the capital like shadows. Coordinated, wordless, unstoppable. The task force that Traoré had built in secret now moved with surgical precision. They carried no insignias, no chants, no flags, only conviction. In the presidential compound, the command room glowed with the dull light of screens. Maps, coordinates, and faces lit the air like constellations of corruption. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the center, still, silent, focused. The air around him felt charged, like the moment before a storm strikes. He watched the live feeds. One target detained, another trying to flee through a private airstrip. A third, still inside his estate, surrounded by bodyguards who didn't yet know the futility of resistance. But Traoré wasn't watching for arrests. He was watching for truth, because he knew. Power never confesses. It must be confronted. At 2:37 a.m., a call came through. The final suspect, the man who owned La Rivière Bleue, had been located. Not in exile, not hiding abroad, but in the very heart of the city, inside an abandoned financial district building that once hosted IMF meetings decades ago. A fitting irony, Traoré didn't hesitate. "I'm going," he said. The officers in the room turned, startled. "Sir, it's not safe." But he was already walking. Outside, the rain was relentless again, sheets of water cascading from the heavens as if cleansing the sins of the earth. His convoy moved through near-empty streets, headlights cutting through fog and silence. The city loomed dark and watchful, its secrets whispering in puddles and gutters. When they arrived, the building rose like a relic of arrogance, tall, skeletal, and half devoured by time. Its windows were blind. Its walls still bore faint traces of old banners proclaiming economic prosperity for the new Africa. He entered without ceremony. No flashlights, no words. Only the echo of footsteps on cold marble. The air smelled of dust, rain, and something older. Decay, perhaps, or guilt. And then, there he was. The man. The architect of suffering disguised as sophistication. The businessman whose polished smile had hidden 1,000 crimes. He was standing at the far end of the hall, hands clasped behind his back, waiting. "So," the man said, his voice smooth, confident. "You came yourself." "I heard you're fond of heroics." Ibrahim didn't answer. He stepped closer, his boots echoing softly. The faint lightning outside illuminated his face, calm, unreadable, carved from something harder than anger. "You could have joined us," the man continued. "Do you think the world changes with speeches and morals? We feed nations, we move money, we build influence. You fight ghosts with conscience." Traoré stopped a few feet away. "You build prisons," he said quietly. "And you call them markets." The man smiled, shaking his head slowly. "Idealism. You think you can purify a system that was built on exploitation itself? You'll fall." "They all do," lightning flashed again. Thunder cracked like the voice of judgment. Traoré looked at him for a long time. Then, slowly, he removed a small device from his coat pocket and placed it on a table between them. It began to blink red. "Everything you just said," he murmured, "was heard by every station in the country." For a heartbeat, silence devoured the room. Then, chaos. The man lunged for a weapon. Traoré's soldiers moved instantly, restraining him. Files scattered across the floor, papers fluttering like white birds trying to escape. Outside, the rain struck harder, wind howling through broken windows as if the sky itself raged. Within the hour, the broadcast reached every corner of Burkina Faso, then Africa, then the world. Footage of luxury estates hiding chains of exploitation. Names of men who once dined in government halls. Recordings of their laughter, their deals, their cruelty. And amidst it all, one unseen voice, calm, resolute, exposing the darkness they had fed for decades. By dawn, the world was awake. Some called it scandal. Others called it revolution. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was something deeper. Vindication. Proof that justice wasn't a myth told by the poor to comfort themselves. In the streets, people gathered, not in protest, but in silence. Women held candles. Men removed their hats. A collective mourning for everything they had lost, and a collective awakening for everything they could become. Inside the compound, Ibrahim watched from the balcony. The sky was breaking open with the first light, pale, soft, forgiving. He could hear the faint hum of radio anchors speaking his name. The tone wasn't worship. It was disbelief. He hadn't given speeches. He hadn't made threats. He had simply acted when no one else dared. A soldier approached quietly behind him. "Sir," he said, "the world is reacting. Some governments are displeased. Aid might be suspended." Traoré didn't turn. "Then we will eat what we grow," he replied softly. Below, the people began to chant. Not his name, but one word repeated again and again, like a heartbeat echoing through the streets. Dignité. Dignity. He closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something fragile and powerful move through him. Peace, not as an ending, but as a beginning. The storm that had started in a small restaurant had torn through the nation's soul, and now it was gone. What remained was quiet, raw, real, but even in victory he knew there would be consequences. There always were. Justice has a price, and history always collects. He looked once more at the horizon, the rising sun breaking over a land soaked in both rain and redemption, and whispered, barely audible, "Let them come, because this time, Africa was not afraid to fight for its reflection." Morning spread across Ouagadougou like a cautious promise. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that mirrored fragments of the awakening sky. Faint orange hues, traces of cloud, and the trembling reflection of a city reborn. The streets were quieter than usual, yet there was a hum beneath the silence, a pulse that wasn't fear anymore. It was change. Vendors opened their stalls slower than usual, eyes still darting to radio sets perched on shelves, listening for the latest updates. Old men gathered around transistor radios, their faces lined with disbelief and cautious pride. Women who had spent lifetimes swallowing injustice now walked with their heads a little higher. Even the children seemed to sense something had shifted. The air itself felt cleaner. Burkina Faso had woken up different. Across the capital, screens replayed the same footage again and again. Ibrahim Traoré confronting the businessman in that decayed building. The files scattered, the broadcast going live. It wasn't just news, it was an awakening. On international networks, the headlines were split between admiration and alarm. African leader dismantles shadow network. Shockwaves in global politics as Traoré exposes elites. Hero or rebel? The world divided over African presidents' actions. In neighboring countries, people watched in awe, some in tears. For once, Africa wasn't portrayed as broken, begging, or helpless. It was fierce, defiant, human. Traoré's decision to act had done what no summit, no aid package, no diplomatic speech had managed. It reminded the continent of its dignity. But inside the presidential residence, Ibrahim sat alone. The power had gone out hours ago. A subtle message, perhaps, from the outside world. The backup generator hummed softly, bathing the room in a dim orange glow. He sat by the window, the soft murmur of distant chants reaching him like echoes from another lifetime. He wasn't wearing his uniform. Just a simple shirt? His hands were folded on the table, calloused hands that had held rifles, documents, and the weight of an entire people's expectations. Beside him, a photograph. It was the pregnant woman from the restaurant. She had sent it 2 days earlier, a picture of her newborn son wrapped in a small white blanket. She had written just 3 words on the back. "He has hope." He smiled faintly. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, relief maybe, or the fragile understanding that history never ends with applause. It begins in silence. The door creaked open. His advisor, Amadou, entered. Eyes tired, voice heavy. They're calling it a revolution, he said softly. The markets are crashing. The embassies are nervous. I expected that, Traoré murmured. They want answers. They want control again. He looked up slowly. They had control. Look what they did with it. Amadou hesitated, then nodded. He understood. He had been there that night. He had seen the men dragged from marble halls, the files of bribes, the evidence of exploitation wrapped in legal jargon. He had watched Ibrahim stand tall not as a ruler, but as a mirror to every African who had ever been told they were powerless. People are calling you a hero, Amadou said. I don't want to be one, Traoré replied. Heroes fade. Principles remain. Outside, distant music rose. Drums, voices, laughter. It wasn't celebration, not exactly. It was relief. The sound of a people realizing they weren't alone in their struggle. But peace is fragile. And Ibrahim knew this moment of light would be tested. The world never forgives defiance. By midday, reports came in. Sanctions were being discussed. Certain international accounts had been frozen. A major trade partner had temporarily suspended relations. Yet even as the foreign world pulled back, something beautiful began to bloom internally. Farmers' unions met with engineers to discuss self-sufficient irrigation projects. Students volunteered in rural schools. Local entrepreneurs pooled funds to start small manufacturing ventures. Burkina Faso, the name that meant land of upright people, was living up to itself again. That evening, Ibrahim went for a walk alone through the old quarter. The air smelled of dust and roasted corn. Children ran barefoot past him, chasing a deflated football. No one saluted, no one bowed. They just smiled, and that was enough. He passed by the restaurant, La Rivière Bleue. The windows were boarded up now, the sign half broken, the inside empty. But he could still hear the echo of that night. The laughter that had turned to silence, the tremor in the woman's voice, the stillness in his own when he said, "Enough." He stopped for a long moment. Then he whispered to himself, "It started here. Some stories begin in palaces. This one began in a restaurant. Days turned into weeks. The global backlash intensified. Foreign analysts called him reckless. Economists predicted collapse. But as months passed, the predictions failed. A quiet resilience emerged from within. Communities organizing, trade rerouted, agriculture revived, and something extraordinary began to happen. Other African nations started asking questions. Why must justice wait for permission? Why must dignity come with debt? Why can't Africa write its own script? Soon, murals began appearing across cities, of Traoré standing not as a ruler, but as a man beside ordinary people. Farmers, teachers, soldiers, mothers. Below them, 3 words, "We are enough." It wasn't propaganda. It was prophecy. By the end of the year, the African Union Summit looked different. The air felt heavier, the glances sharper. Leaders whispered, analysts observed. And when Ibrahim walked in, the room didn't erupt in applause, but in silence, the kind that carries respect too deep to need words. He spoke briefly. Only once. No nation should fear standing for its people, he said. If justice costs us comfort, let it. If dignity costs us wealth, pay it, because the debt of silence is always greater. The hall stayed quiet long after he finished. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny the conviction in his voice, the sound of a man who had nothing left to prove, only something left to protect. Later that night, as he returned home, he found another letter waiting. It was from the same woman. Her son's name, she wrote, was Ibrahim. He read the name twice, smiled faintly, and looked out toward the horizon, where the last traces of sunset faded into night. Somewhere beyond the city, drums began again, soft, rhythmic, alive. The revolution wasn't in the streets anymore. It was in the hearts of people who finally remembered what they were worth. And as the wind whispered through the capital, carrying the scent of rain and renewal, Ibrahim Traoré whispered back, a single vow to himself and to Africa. May we never forget how small acts of courage change the destiny of nations.